Everything we've learned so far about metabolism has been about in a regular state of eating, but now we're going to take a look at how things change when you overeat, which we call feasting in this chapter, and then when you don't eat enough, which is going to be our fasting. So starting off with feasting, when you overeat, we already know that when you consume anything in excess, it will end up being stored as fat. We don't have storage for protein, so when you eat more than your body has a reason to use, then it is going to be converted to fat for storage. Carbohydrates, we can store some of it as glycogen, but when glycogen is filled up, then the remainder is going to be converted to fat as well. So anytime you eat in excess, it's converted to fat. And now we're going to go ahead and take a look at how that is capable of happening. So when you take a look over here, this is a slide that we saw before, but just taking a look back at it, if you notice, if you take a look at acetyl-CoA, the step from acetyl-CoA to fatty acids is reversible. And so that tells us that anything that can become acetyl-CoA can be made into fatty acids. If we look at the glucose going down the center, what we learned so far is it becomes glucose to pyruvate to acetyl-CoA and then goes to the TCA cycle. But if we have more glucose than we need and more than we can store, instead of going to the TCA cycle downwards, it's going to move to the right and be converted to fatty acids. Same thing with our protein. Our amino acids can become acetyl-CoA, and that means that they can be converted to fat when it is in excess. On the other end of the spectrum, we have fasting. Fasting is when we don't have enough nutrients. Now, remember we said that your body is going to be using glucose primarily for fuel. That's what the body prefers for fuel. And so when the glucose starts to be depleted in your bloodstream, it's because you're not eating, what your body will do is it will go to your glucose stores, which is glycogen, and it will start to use glycogen for fuel. But eventually that is going to start running low. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at what happens. Now when you start to run out of your glycogen stores, we're going to have to find another way to fuel the body. And this is again a review of what we've talked about before. If you remember, we said the majority of the body can run off of ketones, which are made out of fat, and then the brain and red blood cell specifically need glucose. So if you've run out of glucose, then your body's going to have to find a way to make it if you're not giving it to your body. And if you're fasting, we're assuming that you're not giving it to your body. So in that situation, your body's going to have to make its own glucose. So if we did need to make our own glucose, let's look at what our options are. Now, if we can use fat to make glucose, that's always going to be our first bet. Remember, we mentioned in our previous chapters that we don't like to use glucose for fuel or to make glucose unless it's our body's last resort, because we don't have excess protein stored in our body. So we don't have a place where we can just go get some extra protein that's not needed and convert it to glucose or fuel. We are going to have to break down our own muscles or other tissues in our body that are made of protein and use that to turn it into fuel or glucose for our body. So that's not something that we want to do. So if we can avoid that, we will always avoid that. So we want to take a look at our fats first to see if that is an option. So taking a look at our fats, remember we said our fats are made out of triglycerides. Thus most of the fat that come from our diet is in triglyceride form. And triglycerides are made with 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. We know glycerol enters right before pyruvate, so technically glycerol is capable of making glucose. So we could use that part of our fat to make glucose. But if we look at the fatty acids, they enter at acetyl-CoA, where it is not reversible. So we actually can't make glucose out of our fatty acids. Now again, think about it. The triglycerides are made of 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. So thinking of it that way, only a small part of the fat can be used to make glucose, because the rest of the fat is actually made of fatty acids, and those cannot be used to make glucose. So because of this, the body is not going to be able to keep up with its demands just using our fats, because only a small part of the fats can be used to make glucose, and that is the glycerol portion. So again, most of the fat structure, which is the fatty acids, cannot be used to make glucose. We can make a little bit of glucose using the glycerol unit that's in our fat structure, but that's not going to be sufficient enough to keep up with our body's demands. So at this point, we are desperate, so we are going to have to go over to our protein structures and use those to make glucose instead. So remember, we had some amino acids that were glucogenic and some that were not. So thinking about that, our glucogenic amino acids are going to be the ones that are going to be used in this situation, because that means that they are capable of making glucose. So for example, this set over here can enter at pyruvate. That means it is still reversible back up into glucose. So just to recap, for situations where we need to make our own glucose, we can technically do that with part of the fat, the glycerol part, but that's only a very small portion, and it's not going to be enough to keep up with the body's demands. So we're going to have to go to our last resort, which is breaking down our own body structures to get the protein that was in there, and using the glucogenic amino acids to make glucose for us. Now, that was how we would make glucose for the parts of the body that can only run off of glucose, but remember we said that most of the body can actually run off of something called ketones. If we take a look at how ketones are made, technically ketones are made from putting together 2 units of acetyl-CoA. I don't need you guys to memorize the full structures. I just want you to know that ketones are made from attaching 2 acetyl-CoA together. And we'll see why that's important in our coming slide. So now that we know that we use acetyl-CoA to make ketones, let's go ahead and look at our options here. Now technically all of our nutrients can make acetyl-CoA, which means they can all make ketones, but we're not going to be using the glucose to do that. We're not going to use our carbohydrates to make ketones, and the reason for this is if we had glucose, we would just use that for fuel. The reason we're making ketones is because we don't have glucose to use for fuel. So this over here would not be an option. That leaves us with our proteins that can make acetyl-CoA and make ketones for us that way, and our fats that can do the same thing. Remember, proteins are our last resort, because whenever we use proteins for fuel, that means we're breaking down our muscles. So if there's an alternate option, we're going to do that first. So right now, we do have an alternate option. We said we've canceled out glucose, but we still have fat as a possible option. So let's take a look at that. With our fats, our triglycerides, the type of fat that we find in our diet, is made of glycerol and fatty acids. The glycerol enters right between glucose and pyruvate, where it can technically go downwards and be used to make acetyl-CoA, and that way be used to make ketones. So we can use the glycerol to help us make more acetyl-CoA so that we can make ketones, but our fatty acid part of the triglycerides can also make acetyl-CoA for us. So all parts of the triglyceride structure, all parts of the fat can technically be used to make ketones. And if you guys remember, when we saw how the fatty acids make acetyl-CoA, we saw that acetyl-CoA is made out of 2 carbons attached to coenzyme A, and the fatty acid chain had a bunch of carbons attached to it. So we saw that we could easily break off 2 carbons each and make an acetyl-CoA, and then break off the next 2 carbons, and so on, until we ended up with a bunch of acetyl-CoA just from that one fatty acid. So what that tells us is the fatty acids are actually able to make loads of acetyl-CoA for us. So they're going to be a great source of our ketone production because they can make tons of acetyl-CoA. So that's more than enough to be able to fuel the body. And so for that reason, we don't need to rely on our protein. Now, technically, these proteins are called ketogenic, meaning that they can be used to make ketones. And the reason for this, we now know, is because they make acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA can be used to make ketones. So that explains why these were referred to as ketogenic. And technically, they can do that. But since we can sufficiently make enough ketones with our fats, we're not going to need to rely on these ketogenic amino acids to do that for us. Now this here is a good slide to look at for review. It shows you what happens in each step, starting with feasting, and then short-term fasting, and then long-term fasting. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens. At the very top, we have feasting, when you overeat. And we have carbohydrates, fat, and protein. In the carbohydrates bar at the top, it shows that some of the glucose is going to be used, some of it is going to be stored away in your glycogen stores, and then the rest is converted to fat. If you notice, the protein is the same thing. Some of the amino acids are used to make body protein structures, and then the rest of it is stored as fat. So that's what we already know about what happens when you overeat. Now, on the other end, we have fasting. So let's say that you have gone a few hours between your meals. That's what we call your short-term fasting. So about 2 to 3 hours between meals or so is short-term fasting, and we go through that on a daily basis. Now, with the short-term fasting, remember we said when you aren't actively eating, your body will use your stores for energy. So that's what you see happening here. In the blue bar, we now have our glycogen stores from the liver and muscles that are going to release glucose so that they can fuel our body. Now, the body isn't going to want to use up all of that glucose to fuel the whole body, because then we're going to run out quickly. So the body will also use some fat to fuel the other cells in the body that don't necessarily need glucose. Now, the one thing that you'll notice is that there is not a pink bar in the short-term fasting. The pink bar is supposed to be protein, and in short-term fasting we don't see it there. And the reason for that is because protein is something that we don't want to use for energy unless we're absolutely desperate. Because if we use it for energy, that means we're breaking down our muscle. So in between your meals, 2 to 3 hours, you still have enough glycogen that you can use for energy. We're not desperate yet, so we're not going to use protein. Now, when we go on to our long-term fasting, so about 24 hours or so without food, at this point, your body is going to have run out of glucose, which is why you don't see a blue bar there anymore, and it's going to have to find another way to fuel your body. Now, the thing that you'll see here, we have the body protein first. That's going to be any of your tissues, your muscles that the body can break down and use the amino acids from those structures to convert them into glucose. Now, some of those amino acids are not going to be glucogenic, so they won't be able to make glucose, but those we can go ahead and convert to ketones. And then our fats can be broken down into plenty of ketones, so those are going to be what are used to fuel other cells in the body that don't require glucose.